I wanted to talk about the indie comic Bloodstained Teeth, written by Christian Ward and drawn by Patrick Reynolds. The story centers around vampire lore or civilization in contemporary society. In this story, vampires exist among us in the world unseen and use the belief in pop culture lore, like Count Dracula, as a subterfuge to distract from their existence. At the outset of the story, two important rules are introduced. There are only two types of vampires, those that are born and those that are made. Naturally born vampires are referred to as firstborns and have the ability to turn others into vampires. On the other hand, those that are turned are referred to as sips. They don't have the ability to turn others like firstborns, and they apparently lack all kinds of self-control. They're usually thought to be violent, vicious killers with an insatiable thirst for blood. Essentially the common vampire compared to something in the vampire lore, right? So as a result of the Sip's reputation, firstborns have decreed that their very existence of a turned Sip is forbidden. From initial impression, we can see that there's already a hierarchical centralization of power in vampire society. The firstborns take up this aristocratic sensibility and have a much more leverageable power compared to Sips. Since the firstborns have lived for centuries, they've become rich and have taken up shadowy positions of power over human society. They're essentially vampire royalty. And like any royalty, I'm willing to bet that they have plenty of ideas about the nobility of bloodline and genetic superiority. I think we'll get more on this as the story progresses, but since the firstborn are vampire nobility, that makes the Sips akin to like vampire peasants. The story is going to center on the experiences of one firstborn vampire and his Sip-turned children. We cut to firstborn Atticus Sloan having an inner monologue as he turns social media influencer Jennifer Rosen into a Sip vampire. One thing to know about Atticus at the outset of the story is that all he cares about is money. He's a vampire for hire, and for the right price, a minimum of 10k plus 10% future earnings, he'll turn you into a vampire for whatever reason you would care to be one. As Atticus leaves the scene and regroups with his Sip-turned-familiar Joey, the newly minted vampire Jennifer has already posted online about her vampire status. Atticus is apprehensive about this, but Joey dismisses it out of hand because it's the internet, and no one really believes anything from the internet these days. Vampires shouldn't be any different from the run-of-the-mill cryptid hoaxes like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. But Atticus's doubts about turning her worsen when he sees her live streaming a feeding. This is our first nod towards how vampires control narratives of belief by hiding the truth behind hyperbole and pop culture. We'll see this come full circle later on in the chapter. For now, we learn from Atticus and Joey's conversation that Atticus has been running his vampire turning operation for over 40 years now. The guy has definitely kept busy being a vampire. We can surmise that there's probably a sizable Sip population out there, all from Atticus turning people for a profit. And if we believe the initial story premise that Sips are insatiable, thirsty vampires who are violent killers, this could definitely spell trouble. Personally, I think Sips are getting a bad rep from their initial turning, making them go a little crazy, but I think once they've gotten blood, they calm down. We'll see more Sips in the story as it progresses though. We cut to 15 years earlier and see Randolph Kinski, a Dracula superfan, in the hospital getting emergency treatment. He's been shot. He needs blood. The operating doctor, Dr. Phelps, tells him that they'll get him a transfusion, but of course, we know that's not the type of blood he's referring to. After his transfusion, he passes out cold, and we cut to Dr. Phelps looking for a relative or family member to call about Kinski, only to then be notified that Kinski, and a security guard, has disappeared entirely. We can infer that most likely the security guard became Kinski's snack to give him some energy, but Kinski left behind a single belonging, a calling card. This is most likely Atticus's calling card prior to the internet and internet ads. I'm not entirely sure what this scene was for, other than to portray how long Atticus has been doing this, and why some of his Sips want to be vampires. In Kinski's case, he was dying from cancer, but maybe we'll see Kinski again in later chapters of the story. We jump back to the present with Atticus in the car with Joey. They seem to have just left a firstborn party, and from the looks of things, what we'll see in a second, firstborn parties are gatherings of firstborn vampires to feast together on humans or Sip vampires. But we'll see how this actually backfires for Atticus in a moment. Joey asks if he feasted, and we see Atticus at the party low-key, quietly panicking. The Sip in question turns out to actually be a vampire that Atticus has personally turned in the past. Atticus recognizes him immediately as, quote-unquote, that artist who wanted to see again. He was only turned about 2 years ago. I think we're starting to see the ethical question related to vampire turning. From artists who want to see again, or the elderly escaping an impossible cancer diagnosis. Of course you have silly reasons like influencers wanting to be a vampire because it's cool and edgy, but the question remains, if you could actually help someone by turning them into a vampire, could it be a responsible choice to do so? And what does that say about the firstborns who are keen to gatekeep vampirism from the rest of the world? I'm curious to see how the story continues to develop this question and what answers it's going to give us as we get deeper into it. Nonetheless, what we learn about firstborn vampires at this party is that they cannot eat their own vampire-turned children. It makes them terribly ill. And as the other firstborn vampires feast, they ask Atticus if he's lost his appetite. And I feel so bad for this Sip vampire because that's most likely such a painful process for him to be eaten alive, and all he really wanted was his sight back. It really shows how little firstborn vampires care for their Sip cousins. They're just another meal to them. Nonetheless, Atticus plays off his disinterest in the feast by saying that he's already eaten, and while the party is still raging, Atticus is approached by another vampire who has someone he'd like Atticus to meet. We jump to them in front of a picture of the most cliched rendition of a vampire, to which Atticus's accoster asks him whether he knows who this vampire is. Atticus responds drolly, asking him if he's going to introduce him to Dracula, and as Atticus retorts, two firstborn vampires appear from the shadows. They're introduced as Brother Stoker, the First Council's head of public relations, and Mr. Tooth. So with both of their introductions, we can say there is definitely a hierarchical power at play in vampire society. We know there's a council, and vampires have a means of controlling public perception. Mr. Tooth, on the other hand, just looks like the muscle between the two of them. But anyway, Stoker says he made Dracula up. Dracula was always a fiction meant to hide the truth about vampires in plain sight. He was a means to make vampires look ridiculous, so the real vampires could continue doing their thing. Stoker continues and rhetorizes what happens when the myth becomes real. He essentially equates Sips to the familiar cliche of thirsty vampires with no sense of control. This starts to boil down to an interrogation in which Stoker implies that Atticus is the reason that these Sips are getting out of hand. Of course, Atticus denies this, but things don't go so well for him after that. We learn that Mr. Tooth has murdered Joey and clocks Atticus in the head, knocking him out altogether. When Atticus comes to, he's tied to a chair and under interrogation from Stoker and Mr. Tooth. They want to know exactly how many Sips Atticus has made. Of course, we know that Atticus has turned Sips for over 40 years now, so there has to be an insane amount of Sips running around out there. In a final bit of torture, they let Atticus get a little sunlight and give him a final proposition. Atticus is going to find all of his Sip-turned vampires in the next 3 weeks and murder them all. Or Mr. Tooth will find Atticus and murder him. And that's where the first chapter of Bloodstained Teeth ends. I really enjoyed the first chapter as an introduction to Christian Ward's vampire world, and I think this is shaping up to be an interesting graphic novel. I think there's a lot of potential to learn more about the function of this vampire society and how Sips really fit into it. Let me know if you guys enjoyed this novel down in the comments, and if I should continue covering Bloodthirsty Teeth, or if there's another graphic novel you think I should cover. Once again, if you enjoy content like this, make sure to like and subscribe for more. I plan on covering a lot more indie graphic novels and similar pop culture content, so be on the lookout for that in the future. Until then, I hope you guys have an awesome day, and I'll catch you in the next video.